Fantastic. Hello, everyone.
Wait.
Welcome to... Oh,
Go.
hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever live stream from Proponomics for the budget 2025, possibly the most anticipated of all time, I think. I'm Adam Lawrence, and I run the channel, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Duncan Hooper as well. Duncan.
Hello, Adam. So just for everybody watching, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be watching live the budget as it happens, and we will be giving some analysis, some context behind what Rachel Reeves says. As Adam mentioned, an enormous budget, and there's several reasons for that. One is the sheer unpopularity of the government, all the screw-ups that they've made over the last year and a bit in power. Secondly is the state of the economy and the huge borrowing hangover. I think you would say, Adam, a lot of that coming from COVID, which has really left so little margin for manoeuvre for a government, and especially a Labour government that's very keen to be spending money and fulfilling its bold promises that it made when it swept to power for the first time in more than a decade. So this is a very, very big moment. Adam, tell us a little bit about what we should be looking out for.
Well, one of the things that Rachel Reeves chose to do last year, and it was a choice, of course, because it was a big tax-raising budget, was to leave herself very little fiscal headroom, just under 10 billion, just at the 100 million in it. There was 9.9 billion of fiscal headroom left. And all this depends on forecasts and what the OBR say. And I do remember at the time saying, 2% growth was a very, very hopeful growth forecast by the OBR, who are constantly pilloried, really, for the optimism of some of their forecasts. However, UK economy has outperformed, but not to that tune. It outperformed forecasts of other places, like even me, who said it would probably be between 0.75% and 1% this year. And we're currently running at about 1.3%. But
always put your hand up when you get it wrong, don't you, Adam? So you can claim the credit when you get it right, yeah?
Absolutely, it's got to be done that way. But there's not a lot of room there to start with. And then the OBR did change that forecast in March when it was fairly clear that, apart from anything else, last year's shock about national insurance for employers, which was a genuine shock. A supposed £25 billion raise that wasn't really a £25 billion raise, probably raised about between 8 and 10 billion. And also put quite a few people out of work. I think it's probably fair to say, Duncan, because we have seen what we've seen, unfortunately, in every post-war Labour government. Unemployment has been going up since they were elected, although there was a little bit of a trend starting to move upwards anyway. And they might argue, well, you know what, that might be good for productivity, and it might be good if people are getting paid fair wages. They have really, really pushed the wages in the public sector, which obviously the Conservatives had pushed back against for many years. But private sector pay had gone up a lot more than public sector pay during COVID, although that balance has now been redressed. And there's always the pensions argument on that front, which we won't get into just yet. But didn't leave herself a lot of room. Presumably, Rachel Reeves was part of the decision to mandate not to raise taxes on working people. That included national insurance, although obviously that did go up last year because it was the employer's side. They were deemed to get away with it politically, I suppose, apart from anything else. But without much room for manoeuvre and without the ability to raise corporation tax, VAT or income tax, which are the big ones in terms of the money that they bring in, especially income tax and VAT, there wasn't really a lot of room to do much else. So the word of this one has been the Smorgasbord. That makes it sound quite appetizing and appealing. I'd say it's more like a bit of a mouldy buffet at a Premier Inn somewhere that's been out for about 9 hours, to be honest with you. And there's a few bits of stale bread and a couple of...
the bits that are left over are the bits you don't really want, right? All the good bits are not there.
Absolutely. And of course, there's been figures just in the last couple of weeks about the ONS revising how many people have left the UK, how many Brits left the UK in the last year of their figures, which run up to June of 2024. They trebled the number that left because they stopped using survey data and started using people actually moving their tax domicile or their payroll, or company directors leaving the country is something else that other people have been tracking in recent times. So will we get more of the same today? They were fairly bullish last time out that, yes, the people with the broadest shoulders would bear the burden and all the rest of it. But of course, if you do drive all the wealth creators out, it's not going to end up particularly well for the rest of the economy. Everybody, I think, knows the figures these days. Top 1% of income taxpayers pay about 28% of the income tax, even though they earn about 13% of the income. And that's usually, that little rider is the one that people often leave out. But 28% of the tax bill, 13% of the income. There's obviously different ways to look at that. You might look at that and think, well, 13% to the top 1% of people, that's disgusting. But you can see they're paying more than double their share if there was a flat rate system, for example. Not that I'm an advocate of a flat rate system. They don't tend to work apart from anything else. They sound good, like a lot of things in fiscal policy, but they don't really work that well in real time. So
I actually thought, Adam, that you were paying 26% of the nation's taxes. Just yourself, no? Not yet.
Only in stamp duty, not in income tax, Duncan. So no.
So just for me, break down. We're going to be discussing after the budget our summary of what happened. But tell me now, what are we going to be talking about? Give me 3 points that we will be talking about after this budget.
So my predictions are, and I'm pretty confident in these, the income tax thresholds will be frozen once again. Rachel Reeves unfortunately tried to get a bit of political capital last year by not freezing the thresholds in the 5th year of her forecast. So just to explain that a little bit, the OBR and the whole budget game works over a 5-year cycle period. Rishi Sunak and then Jeremy Hunt had already frozen the tax thresholds out as far as they could. We know we went through this big cycle of inflation, and inflation is still up there at 3.6, so we've still got outsized inflation at the moment, and this is the stealth tax way of the government bringing money in. Rachel Reeves last year said,
prediction one is income tax increase without an income tax increase, which fulfills the government's pledge and also raises money from income tax, right? So that's your first prediction.
Nicely put, Duncan. Then, so band G and H, I think it was mooted to be bands F, G and H, but I think F might have been dropped. Will pay more council tax. They'll have their property values revalued. No revaluation around the country since 1991, but this will be what's badged as the mansion tax. Or perhaps there'll just be a levy of £3,000-4,000 per particularly expensive property. But one way or another, bit of political point scoring, it won't raise a lot of money, Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, that revaluation is something that's been talked about for years and years, right? And actually, almost everybody would say they agree with it, but nobody has been willing to implement it because it's so painful to do. It's a really complicated exercise. And also there's just a lot of losers from it and not really any winners. So you think they might actually bite the bullet on that? I mean, my feeling would be if they can avoid doing a revaluation with all the appeals and complaints and complexity and time that's going to take, it would seem much simpler to do a flat rate.
That is very logical, and that's exactly why it probably won't happen, Duncan, I think. I mean, in about 2 years' time, I think that you'll be able to do a revaluation of every property in the country using AI tools and do a pretty incredible job. So ironically enough, this would be a pretty bad time to do a revaluation because it'll be expensive and it'll be slow. But they are doing it in Wales. Remember, they do one every 10 years in Wales now already. So there is an element of precedent in there. We'll see what happens.
Okay, and then point 3, your third prediction.
Help to Buy will be back. That is the whispers that I've been hearing for a couple of weeks. And then if you've seen the FTSE this morning, the house builder stocks have been bubbling along nicely. And this sort of what is effectively insider trading is pretty much never wrong, Duncan, in my experience. So the house builder stocks are going up because, I don't know if you remember, but back in the old 2010s, there were 3 gentlemen at Persimmon who lifted over 100 million quid in bonuses out of their pay packets, thanks to the old Help to Buy. Very, very good deals that they negotiated there. But there is some evidence that it was helpful to the first-time buyer market. And in order to get the houses to be built in the first place, one of the ways to do it is effectively a little sweetener or an incentive or a bribe, depending on whatever you want to call it, in the direction of new build properties only. So not the broader scheme of everything for first-time buyers, but for new build properties specifically to get the country building.
So that is effectively taking money away from people who live in big houses and giving it to people who live in smaller, newer houses or who want to live in smaller, newer houses, right?
Thank you, Robin Hood, for that summary. That's very fair. Very fair.
So 3 points there. We've got income tax thresholds frozen until 2030. We've got a revaluation or some kind of additional levy on G and H homes for the council tax. And then your third point is we've got this help to buy scheme coming back, perhaps in a more limited form. So those are the three things that we're going to be particularly looking out for today. I see this budget as a very political budget, Adam, and I think that the challenge that the Chancellor's had is because the Labour Party is fighting amongst itself, she's almost having to pay as much attention to what MPs want as to what the population wants. And I think this is putting her in quite a tricky position, because I think some of the Labour MPs are a little bit out of touch with what the broader population are looking for. And I say that because, you know, we saw the government fail disastrously to sort out the benefit system. You talked about unemployment. I think one of the big questions lots of people ask about unemployment, especially I have to say people who have jobs, is how much of this unemployment is by choice? How much of this is because actually being unemployed is a pretty good gig at the moment? And, you know, I don't say that myself. I'm not unemployed. I have a job. I'm very privileged to have one. But I think there are a lot of people questioning, you know, exactly how much of this rise in unemployment is because there aren't jobs, and how much of it is because people aren't willing to do the jobs that there are. And, you know, I think whether that's a perception or whether that's a reality, it is something that plays into the consciousness. And I think one of the things that the smorgasbord idea is that Rachel Reeves has really tried to take efforts to not offend, upset, and make sure she can give something to Labour MPs who, you know, have been threatening unrest, you know, threatening to a leadership challenge against Keir Starmer. So I think that's a bit of a challenge for her. Do you agree?
I think that's some seriously insightful commentary there, Duncan, to be honest with you. And I think I'd cover that from multiple angles, really. This government are completely tone deaf, and you can see that from their social media. If you analyse their social media, you put it next to either Reform or the Green Party on either side of the political fence, they're absolutely laying waste to what Labour do. You can see from the content they pump out, they do not understand the person on the street. One anecdotal example, I've got a friend who's a business owner who says her staff were absolutely furious if the two-child benefit cap gets raised, right? So they're on reasonable money, but would be around the median sort of wage in the UK, a pretty fair yardstick. And what do they see? They see people who are not working, potentially getting even more of an incentive to continue not working. And one of the complexity, the economic complexity around that is that when you've had years of significant inflation, and of course we have, and, you know, we've got another 3.8% going on index-linked benefits next year because that was September 2025 CPI figure, then there's that stealthy move forward. Whereas, remember, the biggest thing about benefits, and this pertains back to the number one banker pick of the day, is that they're not subject to taxation, right? So if you freeze all the tax thresholds and then wages go up and, you know, wages are up in the private sector by 40% since 2019, right? So 40%, if you're already earning at minimum wage, you're already in the tax paying band, you're already paying 28%, right? So you don't see that extra 40% on the marginal benefit that you get by your wage going up. You see 72% of 40%. Whereas if the inflation in that same time period is 30%, which is about right for CPI, if you're on benefits, you see all 30% of that because you're not caught back by the tax threshold. So effectively, I'm a big fan of the Charlie Munger phrase, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And benefits have crept forward as there being more incentive to be on benefits, which was a problem we had at the end of the last Labour administration. You know, the benefit system was too generous. Conservatives probably went too far the other way, and there was a lot of pain involved in all of that. But ultimately, we ended that administration pre-COVID with unemployment down at about 3.4%, and we started.
Adam, I'm going to stop you here because there is some breaking news coming in. We've actually got some updates from the OBR come out ahead of the budget, which is very unusual. And they seem to have published their economic forecast. Let me just read you some of those. So they're saying that GDP is forecast to grow by 1.5% on average over their forecast. I think it's a 5-year forecast period. So that would be below what's normally considered to be trend growth, I think, would be seem to be disappointing, I think, from them. It's certainly lower than they were previously forecasting. It says that income tax thresholds will be frozen until the end of 2030-31. So I think one of your predictions has come true even before the speech has been delivered, Adam. Congratulations. Government headroom forecast to expand to 22 billion. Well, I mean, that's a figure that, frankly, I think is a little bit meaningless when you look at these forecasts, and it's something that a lot of time gets spent on that. But they're saying 22 billion of headroom. So that's quite a weird and unexpected development, Adam. Do you know what? Why don't I stick a breaking news sticker on the post, because it feels like that's where we are. What's your reaction to that? You surprised?
So I think the 1.5%, let's start with those points in order, Duncan, in the order in which you raised them. The 1.5%, I think, is a much fairer estimate of growth under this government. Rachel Reeves talked like an Austrian economist before this administration really started. Growth, growth, growth. We're going to cut regulation and all the rest of it. And then we've just seen lots and lots of regulations brought back in. The only liberalisation we have seen really is planning permission, and then some in the city, some financial liberalisation as well around bankers' bonuses and things like that. So 1.5% is a pretty good stab for what the economy will do in spite of the Labour Party, on the basis of there being no further shocks like the employers' national insurance rise. The Smorgasbord should lead us away from all of that. So I don't see the OBR being criticised for an average growth forecast of 1.5 over the period. I think I'm right in saying their forecast last year was 1.8 average growth over the period, which I do think was too high, right? So I can completely understand that. The 22 billion headroom, the speculation was it might be around 15 billion because they knew that 10 was too low. Obviously, there's kind of a 50-50 chance of going either side of the forecast. That's what's tended to happen. Jeremy Hunt actually had quite a following wind behind him in all the budgets that he delivered, in that they hadn't spent as much as they thought they had. And so there were a few bits to give away. How that manifested itself was in a 2% cut in national insurance and then another 2% cut in national insurance for the employees that you might remember. That pretty much came from the headroom that was left over. But I do appreciate your comments that it's not exactly a big deal. It's not exactly, the forecast is wrong as soon as it's delivered, aside from anything else. Yeah. And the tax thresholds, well, there you go. I told you it was a penalty kick, and it was. No surprises at all. There'll be plenty of clips of Rachel Reeves and what she said after last year's budget, when she looked over at the Conservatives and said, I won't be doing that. That's a stealth tax and all the rest of it. So we'll see some clips of Rachel later on saying that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think the problem she's got now, though, that this news is leaked out, is that this is going to overshadow and just throw this impression that this government doesn't know what they're doing, and especially with their communications, that they're in chaos. I mean, presumably nothing to do with her. It looks like it's come from the OBR, but it's just going to undermine a lot of the work she's done in, because they've really tried. For whether you think it's a good plan or not, they've had a plan about how they're going to communicate this budget, and they've been working on it for a long time. And then things like this, really just make it look like that, frankly, they're a shambles. And I know that, the Conservatives are already seizing on it and demanding an inquiry.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because they, aside from the tone deafness, I think the first failing with this budget was placing it on the 26th of November with no really robust commentary about why. So, you know how speculation, media and markets work. Ultimately, if there's an absence of information, then that void will be filled by everything from the most insane conspiracy theories to Occam's razor on the other side, right? And it has looked like in this lead that they don't know what they're doing. They had to buy an extra 4 or 5 weeks with no real explanation as to why. It looked to me, I'm trying to be as charitable as possible, like it might have been a timing thing, because they thought there were going to be some good economic figures released for the month of October in November. And they knew Q3 was pretty miserable, which it was. It was very, very flat. It's been, revised back to basically zero by the ONS, or certainly marginal. So they were hoping for inflation to be on the way down, which it is. They've affected a Bank of England rate cut decision, really, by putting it as late as they have. It's also Thanksgiving in the US today, Dunk. So we've got Black Friday tomorrow. Well, yeah, but we've got Black Friday tomorrow, haven't we, on that basis?
It's Wednesday today, Adam. Just so
you're quite right. It is tomorrow. But there won't be much time. The point is for the US traders to act, respond. And they will be acting. The bond vigilantes are holed up in New York or Curacao or whatever somewhere. waiting for every single word, comma, preposition, and all the rest of it that comes out of Rachel's mouth today. So, you know, it doesn't look like genuinely genius strategic timing. I don't really understand why it's been done in the way that it has.
You don't agree with my theory that they knew it was my birthday and they thought it would be a good day to bring some, you know, birthday gift to me.
That's why you knew it was Wednesday, isn't it? That's why it was Wednesday.
That's how I know what day it is, yeah. But it's interesting you mentioned the markets, because I think the verdict from the markets will be one of the most important things. We haven't really mentioned it yet, but that's really what's going to decide whether this is a good budget or not in the short term. In the long term, obviously, it's going to be the government's ratings. But a lot of people are looking at this and saying, look, is this a government which is credible in the international markets? If the bond markets don't like this, government borrowing gets more expensive, you know, that headroom figure again just gets rubbed out. So, you know, what do you think the markets are going to be looking for here?
Well, there is obviously, and the markets do move. As you know, they say these days they spend about half the time looking at the economic news in the UK and half the time watching the Parliament channel to see what's going on, because certainly when Rachel was crying in the dispatch box, it was certainly jumped upon significantly. But the markets, as a general rule, don't dislike Rachel Reeves, because look at the high-level chat that she's used ever since the start. She wanted to be the Iron Chancellor, you know, that we were going to live within our means. She tweaked the rules a little bit. She didn't go far enough for a lot of people. A lot of intelligent commentary across the spectrum said she could have tweaked the fiscal rules a lot more. In my world, she could have tweaked the fiscal rules to say social housing is a critical part of infrastructure and we could borrow to build social housing. That would have been the only way they could have got anywhere near towards their target, interestingly enough. But the amount of money that needs to go in is very much in the tens of billions a year in order to achieve that. So I do think that the markets don't particularly dislike Rachel Reeves, but I do think also they don't trust her that much. And there's still some of that is simply because there hasn't been enough form. You know, they've been rolling the pitch or whatever you want to call it, and then changing their mind because the OBR figures change. One little decimal point goes somewhere, and suddenly 10 billion quid doesn't need to be found. It is this kind of crazy game of 4D chess that's gone on. And I do think they've got to take some accountability for the amount of leaking they've done to the press, because I think they have damaged the nation's economy, really. I mean that quite seriously. You know, we know as soon as things start to slow down, middle of July, end of July, early August, silly season starts, and there's always going to be a bit of budget speculation. But they fueled the fire here because they've worried too much about what the people think. They don't worry enough about what the people think in terms of the message that comes across. An example being Angela Rayner, the message that came across to her fan base was, well, she's bought an 800 grand flat in Hove. Well, I couldn't afford to do that. Blimey. So, you know, she lost, and they didn't see that. They're tone deaf, like I said, to this sort of stuff, right? So I'm not convinced that the markets hate Rachel Reeves by any stretch. And it's the old be careful what you wish for. Because, for example, Torsten Bell might be the next person in the job. And that would be really interesting. A proper economist, certainly, but certainly to the left of Rachel Reeves, right? Duncan's just disappeared to get a cup of tea, obviously, but he's back now. So we're going to be with Rachel Reeves.
But I can hear you. Don't worry. I mean, I wanted to come back on you because I mean, you actually mentioned to me when we spoke in the Mortar and Margins podcast earlier that this, you know, the government's, let's say, prevarication and confusion around this has been a real opportunity for property owners to buy because the market's been depressed, which has given you some really good valuations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people have been able to, I mean, anywhere with a house above about 500 grand has been struggling to sell it. And they actually haven't really been going on, they haven't even gone on the market as a general rule. So what we've seen in real time play out is the prices at which things are listed at have sunk like a stone on average in comparison to what they were in September, say, which is always a month where lots of quite expensive stuff goes on the property market. So that's one thing that's manifested itself. But another has been, it's very, very easy for, and this is not just property investment by any stretch, this is business as a rule. What is the watchword? The watchword has been that you don't have to make a decision yet. You might as well wait. And that has been, we've heard it again and again and again in the PMIs, in manufacturing, in every single industry, right? people have not wanted to make decisions before the budget. Some of it's on a personal level, and some of it's on a business level. They don't know what's going to happen to ISAs. Who's going to buy a house that's 550 grand if they don't know whether they're going to pay an extra tax or not? It's easy to defer these decisions by 2 or 3 months. And this is part of my argument for why doing it so late has been a bad idea. We've had an extra month of economic harm to the UK, really, that we didn't need to have with stagnation. The flip side of that is this is all like a rubber band, and ultimately the economy will snap back and there should be a bit more of a kick after this. But there's certainly been very, very few willing buyers, especially at property auctions, for example. And that has meant those who have kept calm and carried on buying have been able to pick up just simply because of supply and demand, Duncan.
Yeah. Okay. So until now, there's been some opportunities. We'll see if there's some opportunities after the budget. Should we cut to the live stream now, Adam? Because I can see there's a packed House of Commons. They're listening to just the end of Prime Minister's question time, where I know a lot of the questions have been about this leak from the budget. But there's certainly more MPs than usual in there ready to listen to this budget. And, as you mentioned, it is a big political budget, because I think the future of Rachel Reeves, and to some extent the future of Keir Starmer as well, is on the line here. And from my perspective, I'm particularly interested also to see how Kemi Badenoch can respond to this, because she's also in a very difficult position as this kind of leader of the opposition, who everybody sort of thinks isn't really the leader of the opposition, because everybody thinks Nigel Farage is the leader of the opposition, because the opinion polls are showing him, performing so well, or his party performing so well, that there's a lot for the Conservatives to try and prove that they can have a position in between these two parties. So, yeah, I mean, there'll be a lot to look out for.
Absolutely. I think they've just had a bit of a rough poll, actually, Reform, haven't they? They've had their worst poll for 6 months or so.
There was those issues about Nigel Farage, weren't there? And some of the comments he made at school, I think, had been getting a lot of play.
He's not done the best job of defending himself there, has he, really? So shall I hit the volume, Duncan?
Yeah, let's put it on. So I think we don't necessarily need to listen to all of the questions, Adam. I think Rachel Reeves is going to be starting in probably about 5 minutes.
Yeah, let's keep an eye out for that when she's on.
So people know it's coming up. But we can carry on, discussing some of the more substantive issues. So, you mentioned unemployment, and clearly unemployment and benefits are going to be a key part of this budget, because it's one area where I think, the Labour is under a lot of pressure to be giving, a lot of pressure from their own MPs to be giving something back rather than taking something away, right? So what are you particularly watching out for, and what do you think they can do about fixing the unemployment rate, given that, it seems they're going to raise national insurance, which is going to be very unpopular, I think, a lot in the hospitality business, especially because they're raising it particularly sharply for under 21s. And, the figures I saw is absolutely startling, how that minimum wage for under 21s has changed since 2019. It's doubled, basically. So what do you see the impact of this budget on those unemployment figures, and what should they be doing and could they be doing?
Yeah, so we've already had the national minimum wage figures for next year, and as you correctly say, they've once again carried on with this policy of pushing them up for younger and younger people. But we also know we've got basically 1 million NEETs, as they call them, not in education, employment or training, below the age of 30 in the country. And I think this is sometimes where it manifests itself, that there are not too many business brains in the cabinet, without being too rude about any of them. Because if you run a company and you employ people, there's a large pool of workforce out there, and that's why the median wage is where it is, who have a certain level of skill, or they just work to live, Duncan. It's as simple as that, right? So would you choose, if you're paying the same money, a 21-year-old that you've got to train from scratch, or would you rather employ a 50-year-old who has been through lots of training, has got lots of life experience? There used to be a big incentive in terms of it being a lot cheaper for businesses to employ younger people. That incentive is being destroyed. And the thing is, the Labour Party introduced a minimum wage, obviously, when it first came in. But from an economic perspective, what they did is they brought it in at a level that didn't really push anybody's wage up. I think it was £2.50, if I remember correctly. Yeah, and it started to get into the market and into the market and into the market. And now it's really pushing up, not just the 4 million or so jobs that are at minimum or pegged to minimum, but also the jobs that exist just above that band, because I'm hearing anecdotal stories about people not wanting to be a manager for an extra 50p or £1 an hour. And of course, from a percentage perspective, all that extra responsibility doesn't seem to be worthwhile to be taking on. But of course, what the businesses are then doing is saying, well, how do I survive with fewer people? And we've seen, half the jobs, it's been said, that have been lost since the last budget have been lost in the hospitality sector. And what we're hearing is that today there's going to be a city tax style or overnight tax style couple of quid added onto every overnight stay so we can take it from the tourists. Now, from an economic perspective, that's not outrageous by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, we're the outliers in Europe for not having such an overnight tax. So won't be surprised to hear it. Those who are listening who are interested in short-term rentals who compete in the hospitality sector will, of course, not be particularly happy about this, because if it's £2 a night and you've got your property rented out for 30 nights a month, that's £60 a month you're going to have to find in tax. Some of that will be passed on in pricing, but not all of it, because that's how tax works ultimately. So
it will be interesting to see how that does actually work, won't it, with these overnight stays? Because if you are on a short-term let, how short is so short that you should be paying some kind of tourist tax?
There's
think
already precedent in that sector for VAT to not be levied on if you're turning over too much on stays of over 28 days. Now, that doesn't mean that common sense will be applied to the 28 days, but if you think about what short-term lets tend to be, there obviously there's the leisure stay side of things, but there's an awful lot of contractors who are near Hinkley Point, the Sizewells of the world, the Eden projects, the Teesside Valley Regeneration Project, right? There's a lot of contractors that come from all over the country. The money's pretty good, and they live in short-term accommodation, right? But they live there Sunday to Thursday, maybe, or something like that. Sometimes they have longer contracts in order to get stability. So it'd be interesting to see what drops in or out of scope there. And again, do the government understand that at a granular level? I don't know, Duncan. I don't know.
Just before we start, I want to ask you just one thing. What are you expecting to change in your business? What's the thing that's going to be the biggest impact for you, for your businesses from this budget?
Great question. And I think really a lot of it depends on what happens to property. There's an outside chance that stamp duty might go up again, whether that's on overseas nationals only buying UK properties or whether the additional rate moves up again. That's a big one. So if that does happen, that will ultimately mean we'll be able to do fewer transactions. And ultimately, we'll also be able to offer less money to the vendors, because we'll have to eat some of that tax, but also the vendors will have to eat some of that tax as well. So that's the biggie that really could affect things either way for me. But I'm on the fence on that one, Duncan. I'm certainly not even 50-50 likely to happen, I don't think.
Right. Okay. And then presumably the economic numbers are also important for you, because the way interest rates are going to go, we talked earlier about, whether you see interest rates perhaps not falling as sharply as some might be expecting because the economy might be a little bit more resilient. That's presumably the other big impact for you.
Yeah. And the perverse bit of, talking about raising income tax and then not directly raising income tax, but freezing the thresholds, as we've already now had the confirmation of, that will make a difference, because had income tax gone up, then that would have been disinflationary and would have allowed the Bank of England to say, well, actually, we might be able to cut a little bit more quickly. But I personally think we are, around about 0.5% away from the bottom of this cycle. Whether there'll need to be more because we get into recessionary territory, I'm not seeing any signs of that. I'm seeing an economy that's a bit of a wounded beast but carries on. But I say this quite often, Duncan. Property investors are the second biggest beneficiaries of inflation in the UK, realistically, behind the UK government, because you tend to use debt and you borrow that debt in nominal terms, and that gets inflated away by house prices. Even though for the last 22 years they've only moved up pretty much with inflation anyway, it's still inflation. It's still a compound effect. And the big money ultimately comes from the capital growth within the properties. There's not a lot of people making a lot of margin these days on the operating side of things because of the cost of debt and the cost of delivering the compliance service apart from anything else. So the way the interest rate moves is massively important to my business, absolutely. But then I think we've also got an interesting time ahead when we get towards speculation for the next election, because if the polling looks like it does today, we're going to possibly have someone who might sound a little bit economically credible, but with no track record whatsoever, and someone who doesn't sound economically credible at all. So that could do very funny things to the bond markets. And the bond markets come up every week these days, don't they? This huge power over the government, but they are important. They are very important, and they're important to my business because I don't want volatility. No investors like volatility, right? Volatility is not good.
Yeah.
Unless you're an options trader, a day trader, all the rest of it. You don't want volatility.
Yeah, I mean, I remember covering the bond markets, and it's certainly, at the start of my career, I was working at Bloomberg, and it's certainly something that a lot of people just don't understand, and have this kind of irrational fear of. But the reality is that there are very tangible implications to changes in those prices, and that governments can fall because of them. I mean, we're very used to seeing emerging market governments collapsing because their costs of borrowing become way too high. But the situation that we've got to in Europe now, where the debt levels have increased and increased and increased, and again, I bring it back, your point that COVID has made a big, sort of fundamental change in the structure of finances of countries and governments, means that we are just more and more vulnerable to relatively small changes there. I think Rachel Reeves is probably going to start talking fairly soon. I don't know whether, the fact that all the news has been released early by the OBR maybe means she's not going to bother. She's going to say, guys, you know everything already. I refer you to the newspapers and the leaks from this morning. Thank you very much, and sit down again. Who knows?
That would be quite an approach, wouldn't it? Maybe she'll have the old glass of whiskey like Ken Clark used to.
That wasn't on your predictions, Adam. I noticed you weren't taking the odds on any of the sort of the bingo. I mean, is there a phrase we should look out for? What do you think, or a particular word that we should expect to hear a lot? Stability,
I'm sure we'll hear growth. I'm sure we'll hear plenty about growth, and I'm sure we'll hear a really difficult to listen to first few moments where Rachel tells us what a great job that they've been doing, which we'll struggle to swallow whole, of course.
There may be some reaction in the chamber, I imagine, when she says that.
Yeah, I would expect a little bit of jeering and all the rest of it. Absolutely. What else do we need to look out for? What's she going to say? What are our bingo words for today? Delivering.
I think working families is definitely going to feature, because that is the part of the manifesto that they're trying to defend, because they came into this government saying we will not hit working families. And actually, that's exactly what they have been accused of doing. And she needs to frame this somehow. And we saw that big U-turn about income tax, which is clearly a reaction to that concern that it will be seen as a government that is against working people. So I think that is going to be something that she's definitely going to try and frame this as supporting working people, at the same time that she's going to be announcing changes in benefits and giving a lot of money to people who aren't working. So I think there may be somehow a gap between the rhetoric and the results that we see there. Here she is now.
That's a safe bet, Duncan. That is a safe bet. Here we go.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is my understanding that the Office of Budget Responsibility's Economic and Financial Outlook was released on their website before this statement. This is deeply disappointing and a serious error on their part.
Already leading the news.
The Office of
undermining the budget already.
Have already made a statement taking full responsibility for their breach. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are rebuilding our economy. Over the last 16 months, we have overhauled our planning system to get Britain building, forged new trade deals with the United States, India, and the European Union.
Been forced into forging them, yeah, sure.
System to bring the brightest and the best to Britain. We changed our fiscal rules that we inherited from the Conservatives and raised public investment to its highest
So exactly
level
as you were predicting, Adam, this is the bit where she tells everybody how well the government's been doing, how important the measures it's taken are. And I think, as you said, this is going to feel hollow to a lot of people in that room, but it's going to feel hollow to a lot of people in the rest of the country as well.
they're not feeling it in their pockets ultimately, Duncan. They're not seeing it in their pockets, not feeling it in their pockets, and that's what's going to need to be addressed.
The biggest ever settlement for our National Health Service. They were the fair and necessary choices, and we faced opposition to them, from opponents to planning reform, who will always demand that the future is built somewhere else, not in their backyard. Opponents to trade, who want to take us down the path of isolation and division. Opponents to investment, who believe that the only good thing a government can do is get out of the way. Opponents who insist that
One of the things the Chancellor always has to do in these budgets is contrast the vision that she's presenting with what she says the other parties would bring, because it is, of course, a massive political event. And we mentioned in the build-up, even more so now than usual, because of the disunity within Labour's huge majority. They really shouldn't be having these problems now. You can't emphasise enough that majority is, a three-term majority potentially in normal times, and yet it seems to be falling apart after a year. So there's a lot of work she's trying to do here.
Yeah, very, very fair commentary, Duncan. I think that no one had seen coming the potential problem of having too much in terms of a majority, but it really has played out a bit like that. And this is why we're going to see the two-child benefit cap lifted, I think.
Create jobs and support public services. That is what our plan, that is what this government and our Prime Minister are all about. Today's budget builds on the choices that we have made since July last year. To cut NHS waiting lists, to cut the cost of living, and to cut debt and borrowing.
I can't believe they're trying to claim the NHS waiting list. When you look at the trends and the figures, all it is a dribble down from sort of September last year that's carried on. The numbers are woeful, less than 5% cut in the waiting lists from saying they were going to utilise the private sector and all the rest of it. Very, very, they must be disappointed with those numbers, Duncan.
But the reason they're mentioning them is because they know these are important numbers for the electorate. These are one of the areas where Labour has been trusted on is the NHS, and so it's crucial that they manage to convince people that they are doing something for it, which the strikes, of course, make even more difficult.
As much as they like, Madam Deputy Speaker, as long as they do it from the opposition benches where they can't cause any more damage. I said there would be no return to austerity, and I meant it. This budget will maintain investment in our economy and in our National Health Service. I said I would cut the cost of living, and I meant it. This budget will bring down inflation and provide immediate relief for families. I said I would cut debt and borrowing, and I meant it.
But really, this is still, we're still deep in the political segment. No big news coming out so far from the speech. But I remind those who are watching that a lot of the figures have been released by the OBR before the start of the budget, showing that the OBR, the government's regulator, effectively, who the independent economic forecasters, saying that they expect slower growth, which is bad news for the government, and also that they've announced that the income tax thresholds will be frozen, which Adam predicted before the event.
Do you think she had to do a rewrite, Duncan, or just not time? So she just had to roll with what she had?
I suspect she's going to try and make the same points. I don't think that there will have been time for her to do a complete rewrite. And I think, she's going to try and plow on because, frankly, a lot of the points she's making are not that closely related to the announcements that she's really making. You see what I mean? Like I said, there was that disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality.
Yeah.
And I think, she's trying to make these points regardless of whether the facts on the ground are going to support them, because she needs to, hit those buttons for the voters.
Doesn't just appear out of thin air.
I wonder what happened on the OBR website, whether someone scheduled a post and then put it AM rather than PM or something like that. And it's just as simple as that.
You wouldn't want to be in the office today, would you, Adam?
Well, they're nobody's friends anyway at the best of times, are they? So it's a tough gig. Tough gig.
And creating new jobs and new opportunities. By the men and the women who work hard every day in all parts of our country. Our job is not to watch from the sidelines, but to partner with them, backing them every step of the way, to match private enterprise with public ambition. I would like to thank my team of officials at the Treasury for their hard work in preparing this budget.
Well, I definitely had long enough to do it, Rachel, that's for sure.
Forecast that our economy would grow by 1% this year.
Yeah, my wife used to be involved in making these budgets, and she would describe how in the Treasury they'd all sit around the television cheering whenever one of the elements that they'd worked on came through. They had a bit of a party. I think, they'd get in probably Coca-Cola and crisps, which I think counts as a Treasury party. But yeah, it's certainly a big moment for them, and not a lot of work gets done this afternoon, I think, in the Treasury building.
Is that one of the famous cheese and wine evenings, Duncan, or similar? Or not breaking any COVID rules, of course.
That was well before COVID, Adam.
They are clear that this is not about the last 14 months. It is about the previous 14 years. The legacy of Brexit and the pandemic.
Yeah, I was interested how often Brexit comes up, actually, because that is something that has been...
We should have bingoed the pandemic and Brexit, shouldn't we? Yeah, absolutely.
Because it has been a subject which has largely been ignored by politicians because they know it doesn't play well across the board. It's almost too divisive for anybody who's seeking to bring a majority, so they're trying not to mention it. But I wonder if Labour will maybe start to push that harder as they seek to shore up their core support.
I don't know what your feeling is, but I felt like they just didn't really have much of a position on it, and so they just avoided it because they didn't understand what their position was. Because they could have come in and said, "Look, we need to get back into the single market." For example, the customs union argument is pretty strong in terms of the logical one, right? In terms of what Rory Stewart would have done if he'd beaten Boris Johnson, in terms of all of that sort of thing. But it very quickly becomes obfuscated by passion rather than logic.
I think that's the problem, is the arguments, the simple arguments against it, regardless of the logic behind it. It's just easier to make those simple emotive arguments. And that's why I think they avoid it, because they know they can prove themselves right as many times as they want and it won't matter.
Yeah. Fair. But to not recognise, 400-500 billion quid pumped into the economy through COVID, just because the electorate don't want to hear about it, I think that's weakness, Duncan, to be honest with you. If you want to talk about fiscal responsibility, if you want to keep the bond markets happy, if you want to give people faith that you know what you're doing, that's ultimately what you're going to that's how you would talk. It's how I would talk anyway.
Yeah, it's a bit of an elephant in the room, isn't it? And nobody does talk about it. You're right.
Brick by brick, we've been building our economy, building roads, building homes, getting spades in the ground and cranes in the sky. Growth begins with the spark of an entrepreneur. Half of new jobs in Britain are created by scale-up businesses, and we want those jobs created here, not somewhere else. Our job is to make Britain the best place in the world to start up, to scale up, and to stay.
That's just not going to happen, Rachel, but it's a nice idea in principle,
Enterprise incentives.
Yeah, I know someone who was brought into the Treasury the other day to give a talk about why the US is so much more competitive than the UK, and they said a lot about the fact that in the US there is this culture of failing. The penalties for failing are so much less than they are in the UK, where you can get disqualified from being a director of a company if your business doesn't work out, which essentially means that you can never work again in that industry. And I think there are lots of fundamental things about the British system which are unappealing, let's say, to entrepreneurs.
Yeah, although you still have more startups in Cambridge than you do in the whole of Germany, so it's all relative. But we look at the US.
Absolutely.
I understand why we look at the US, but ultimately we struggle to compete, don't we? And the more global the world becomes, the more, if you are currently talented in AI, some of these guys and girls are writing checks of hundreds of millions of dollars, so we can't compete with that on a capital front apart from anything else, so there are structural issues that keep us behind where we would want to be, I think, as well.
Someone who has invested £1,000 a year in an average stocks and shares ISA every year since 1999.
I see we've got a couple of comments, Duncan. Someone saying their job's to do what the public want, not what they want. I wouldn't agree with that, I'm afraid. I think their job is to do what's best for the public, even if it's unpopular, not to do what the public want, because what the public want would probably send the bond markets into a tailspin, ultimately. It's the old magic money tree argument, I think.
Yeah, if you ask the public, should you spend more money on NHS and cut taxes, they'll say yes.
Absolutely.
And thanks to our changes to financial advice and guidance, banks will be able to guide savers to better choices for their hard-earned money. Over 50% of the ISA market, including Hargreaves Lansdown, HSBC, Lloyds, Vanguard and Barclays, have signed up to launch new online hubs to help people invest here in Britain.
This is a really interesting angle about investing in Britain, and there's a carrot and a stick argument here. I'll be interested to see how this actually plays out, because this is something we're really, really bad at. Our pension funds, for example, have chucked so much money abroad, and of course their job is to go after returns.
Both. I mean, they're doing what their investors want, right?
But it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy ultimately as well. And if your pension fund members are going to stay in the United Kingdom, there's also an argument for a strong United Kingdom, right? But we're at such a low ebb in this department. Anything should be able to help, because we can't really go much more out of the country with our pension fund investments. So incentivizing with tax does make an element of sense to me, but you won't get the person on the street to start investing in stocks when they weren't, just because of tax, in my opinion. I've written fairly extensively about this in the past, Duncan, and one of the things I said was you should get people like Martin Lewis and other financial influencers to have a sponsored fund-style product that would look a bit more like a Vanguard Life Strategy Fund or something like that. Wouldn't be anything particularly ambitious, but people would trust it because they trust Martin Lewis, not because they trust stocks and shares. And this is a really good example for me of the tone deafness that goes on in Westminster versus what would actually cut through to the people.
Yeah,
right?
Because people don't necessarily trust the banks. The people that aren't putting their money there, a lot of it is that I don't trust these banks with the money. You know, I'm worried what they'll do with it, and I also don't agree with perhaps some of their ethics.
And we're continuing to drive investment in city regions.
That's a pretty good handle. Someone we just had a comment from, Anarchy of the West. I think we know where they stand on most things by the sounds of it.
With our commitments to the Northern Growth Corridor,
I thought that was your handle, Adam. No,
I'm Anarchy of the East. On a Sunday.
And I will today provide further funding to increase planning capacity through a new skills offer, as called for by the British Chamber of Commerce and the Confederation of British Industry. It is this Labour government that is investing.
So we do have a mansion tax on properties worth more than 2 million, Adam, which I think will be announced shortly. But that was in the OBR release.
I've seen a few of the leaks. Yeah, I'm looking at a couple as well. You know, national insurance changes on salary sacrifice, raising 4.7 billion. I mean, that's a huge result, that is. Not really salary sacrifice anymore then, is it?
And within 3 months, we will set out.
And of course, tax rates going up on dividends, property and savings. So
yeah, that was bound to happen, wasn't it? Again, this is working people argument, Adam.
Yeah.
Who earn that money are not working.
No.
So that we buy, make and sell more here in Britain.
Dividend tax on certain things now, though, is going to exceed national insurance plus income tax. So the old fairness and equivalence argument, which has been used this morning by Rachel herself, doesn't appear to be that fair to me, given that dividends only get declared post-corporation tax, Duncan. But there we go.
And invested in Sheffield Forge Masters. And it's why we've changed government procurement, so we can buy British when it is crucial to our national security. For steel, for shipbuilding, and today for AI, driving innovation and building that great industry here in Britain. But it's not just what we invest that matters, it's how we invest. Putting money and power back in the hands of local and regional leaders. Today, we are devolving £13 billion of flexible funding for 7 mayors to invest in skills, business support and infrastructure.
The devolution argument really interests me, you know. Really interests me, because I thought with the reform quake earlier this year, it would really hamper some of their appetite for devolution. I don't know whether they're sort of pushing on through regardless because they really believe in it. And I know there's a lot of intelligent commentary that says we've been too centralised. Thatcher centralised things too much. We've suffered since then. Government's so much more complex than it used to be. I don't know where you are on that, Duncan.
Well, I think the challenge is that the government doesn't want to let go of the money, Adam. And I mean, we hear Rachel Reeves there talking about, you know, she'll throw them some peanuts. But, you know, the truth is that, you know, local councils' ability to make decisions and make change has been enormously eroded by the fact that they've had to spend so much money on social services and these kind of core things that they need to deliver, and they're getting less and less money from the government, they just have less margin to make their own decisions. We saw that with Reform, who came and said, we're going to make all these changes, and then they found actually we don't have any margin to make any changes because all the budget we've got, we're spending it on on social care. And what can we change? Frankly, we can't cut any more without cutting things that we're legally obliged to do, and we can't really raise any more revenue because we're hitting the limits of the council tax rises already.
Yeah. But again, this pertains back to a lot of my core argument around 2% inflation being a pipe dream these days. If you threw a dart where council tax rises will be next year, they'll be between 4.5 and 4.8%, right? That's where they're going to be. So where does that fit in with your 2% inflation target in the world? It's a pipe dream. A lot of people don't realise over the course of the 2010s, so pre-COVID, forget everything apart from obviously we had picking up the pieces after the financial crisis, but arguably there's deflationary elements and inflationary elements to that, right? Quantitative easing, blah, blah, blah. Inflation was 2.7 on average over the course of that decade before you had a pandemic, so
you had globalization and China still pushing down prices of so many materials, right? Before, we had these price shocks from supply chains breaking down.
Yeah. Food inflation was pretty much zero between 2013 and 2019 as a general rule on basics. That's why it's been such a shock to see what's happened since 2020.
But the problem is, if you're going to have growth of 1.5% and you're going to have inflation of 4%, Adam, like you said, maybe for property owners, this might be a happy scenario, but for the rest of the country, that's going to make things quite difficult.
Yeah. And it looks like dividend tax is an extra 2% across the board on all dividend rates.
Well, that will make it
next year. And that's on top of the UK's biggest ever warship export deal with the Norwegian government to build frigates in Glasgow, supporting 4,000 jobs. Investment opposed by.
It was pleasing to see the manufacturing figures of the flash manufacturing ones for this month anyway were back above the 50 handle. So there is a little bit of life being breathed into manufacturing, and we often get a bit of a bad rap and falling out of the global top 10 and all the rest of it. But we're pretty good at the high skilled stuff, and I guess that rightly or wrongly, the reintroduction of hostility in Europe, aside from anything else, means that this defence money needs to be spent somewhere. And when it comes to shipbuilding, we are still a natural destination, which is at least some element of positivity for all of that.
Yeah. And I think in comparison with many other countries, our manufacturing sector now is so efficient because it has had to be. It hasn't been able to rely on the state support and the subsidies that in so many other countries they have. And I think that, as those dry up, because simply they can't afford them, it will mean that our industries therefore get to compete very strongly, I would expect.
Yeah, this is the thing, part of the productivity argument about unemployment being forced up. You have to go in and do those efficiencies. You have to. What you're going to do is cut the least productive part of the workforce. That is ultimately how the invisible hand works or whatever. So is there a positive in that? And it's very difficult. You can ask 100 economists what the ideal unemployment rate would be in the UK, and you'd get 100 different answers. No, because
you don't want zero, do you? I mean, that's the common misconception.
Absolutely.
You don't want nobody to be unemployed.
Don't want less than 3%, really. Below 3% is really dangerous territory. A little bit like inflation. You don't want 0.1. You're dangerously close to deflation, which is much, much more damaging to an economy than a slightly hot inflation.
They also doubled the national debt. Our net financial debt this year will be £2.6 trillion, 83% of GDP, meaning that today, 1 in every £10 that government spends is on debt interest.
Where would you like to see that number, Adam, the 83% of GDP? Because that's a number that's quite closely followed, and I think is significant, actually. And, I think when you're talking about getting over 100%, that is a problem. Where do you think that should be sitting? Because
I'm really glad you've asked that, because she's used a little bit of trickery there, because notice she slipped in the word net debt. So we're used to seeing 96, 97%, but that's the gross debt. right? And this argument's often used about the economy of Japan. Their gross debt is 250% of GDP, but actually their net debt is about 70%. So we're actually in a worse position than the economy of Japan when it comes around to it. You very rarely hear that net debt argument used. So that is interesting, and she might be hoisting her own petard there. I mean, realistically, 60% would be a workable number. I don't have an issue, though. If one of the things she did last year, which she got no political capital for whatsoever, was borrow to invest in infrastructure that won't vest until after the end of this parliament, right? And I think we've lacked that vision for some time. If you remember when Boris got elected, he actually came in and said, we're going to spend 650 billion over this parliament on infrastructure, because they knew how much it was needed. It would have been great for the economy. And it's such a shame that Sunak didn't press ahead with some huge bond raising when interest rates were effectively zero, although technically not the government's job, it's the job of the DMO, Debt Management Office, obviously, but still there could have been some significant influence on COVID bonds and things like that that were invested in the United Kingdom at the time, because that would have created jobs and paid back. There's pretty good payback on most of this sort of stuff. So it does depend what you're borrowing for, but
you need to have a long horizon, don't you, Adam? And that's the challenge, I think. And because less than 5-year horizon, you can't get results from that kind of project.
100%. And this is where, when you've had an authoritarian, blip like a COVID, where regimes like the CCP in China and in the Emirates and things like that did a much better job, or were deemed to do a much better job, you're bound to see this sort of fallout. It hasn't helped to have this relative short-termism. And the only way out of this, Duncan, is to depoliticize some of this stuff, which I know has been suggested time and again, but part of the reason why the House of Lords exists, right? Crossbench peers, crossbench groups, things like that. People don't necessarily appreciate how much attempts there are to do these things, but when you've got 170 odd seat majority, also the House of Lords has much less power than it would if you've got a 10-seat majority, unfortunately. So that's not necessarily working well at this time. But I did believe the good intentions of Rachel Reeves when she talked about investing for the long term last year. I mean, I really dislike this idea of the Conservatives crash the economy, however, because in the same way that I really dislike the idea that Labour have crashed the economy. The economy has been pretty stagnant after a V-shaped event around the pandemic. That's what the numbers say. No one crashed it, Liz Truss sent the bond markets wild. Sure thing. Recovered fairly quickly. Within a few months, we were in quite good shape, actually. And then things continued to vest in terms of the energy crisis, in terms of the Ukraine situation, in terms of all of the rest of that.
Again, it comes back to your points of comparison, doesn't it? I think if you looked at, the UK compared with some of the European countries around it, it's very much a comfortable positioning in terms of economic growth. I think if you compare it to the US, you're looking at two different graphs. Can't even put them on the same scale.
Well, that is equivalent to cutting every police officer in our country twice over. And then there is Reform, who promise more than £100 billion of cuts, with no details of where those cuts will come from or who will pay for them. A recipe for devastating damage to our public services.
We're back to blaming the last guys again. Here we go.
They wanted roads that aren't full of potholes. They want police on
and there will be a charge for electric car use the roads, Adam, which, to be honest, seems like a fair deal to me, because they're not paying fuel duty, so they're not paying that fees to keep up the cost of the road.
It's got to come from somewhere, Duncan. It's got to come from somewhere.
The more you drive, the more you should pay. Seems like a relatively fair system to me, although it is deeply unpopular because people love their cars and they feel that any attempts by the government to restrict their usage of them is a bad thing, perhaps not realizing how much they do pay every time they fill up with petrol in tax.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. It's same as when you go and have a pint of beer these days and how much is VAT and duty and all the rest of it. It really is very significant. But it had to happen. Road pricing is inherently there, but in the UK, we're inherently irrational about things like toll roads. And so pay per mile, look, it's really the only way you can do it. Fuel duty's been frozen since 2010. And it needs to continue to be frozen realistically. There's still plenty of petrol cars being sold, though. And the idea of no petrol cars after 2030 is long gone, obviously. 25%, I think, on the recent figures of all vehicles sold were full battery electric vehicles, but over 50%, including the hybrids and all the rest of it, were electric inspired. But yeah, there'll be some people, I mean, those of us who got on the electric bus early, it was just too good to be true, ultimately. 0% benefit in kind. Could write down the whole value of a lease against the company profits. The accountants were losing their minds with how good getting a Tesla or other brands are available, obviously, were. But it was always going to be the case. And the people who feel aggrieved, I think, Duncan, are the people who bought those electric cars in the last month or so, who are now going to get caught by all of that. But same reason the congestion charge in London has got to go on them. They're still congesting things. And actually, part of the problem with electric vehicles is they're an awful lot heavier than ICE vehicles. So the wear and tear on the roads will be much, much more significant. So they need to pay more, if anything else.
Especially heavier if you fill the boot of your car with bowling balls, Adam, right? Your son is a bowling champion. I think it makes it much more expensive to drive your car. Anyway, back to the budget.
I can go further. I have heard representations from Labour Coalfield MPs, including my honourable friends, the members for Bassetlaw, Blythe and Ashington, Barnsley South.
Again, the pressure from the Labour backbenchers on the government here, really, explicit.
The Investment Reserve Fund of the British Coal Staff Superannuation Scheme to its members. So that the men and the women who worked in our coal industry get a fair deal in their retirement too.
Sounds like a nice gesture. I wonder how much that's costing.
Yeah, we haven't talked about retirement much, I was going to say, Adam, and pensioners, because, they are one of the groups which have done pretty well, I would say, in the last few years because of the arrangements put in, under previous governments to make sure that their pensions would not get eroded by inflation. And inflation being high has actually relatively been a good thing for them because it's not hurt them in terms of their income. And
they got snipped the 1 year on the triple lock, didn't they, when inflation was ridiculous?
But that was crazy.
But the Conservatives did do an awful lot more to get pensioners out of poverty than they did to get children out of poverty. That's what the data shows. And of course, we can be as cynical as we like about that because ultimately, where's their voter base come from, aside from anything else? But that does sound like a red wall policy there, going after the old colliery towns, because they've lost the dressing room there, and Reform have been absolutely surging in those polls. I wonder if it's just a straightforward attempt to get them back to an extent. But it'd be interesting to see what the cost of all that is. But pensions in general is a huge issue with public sector pensions. They're just completely unsustainable because the amount of contributions that needed to go up. I've got a friend who's a teacher, and the teachers' pension scheme they're opted into has gone from the employer paying 16% of their salary, and this is only 7 years ago before COVID, to paying 37% of their salary into the same scheme to give them a 37. I mean, employers are reeling at 15%, right, for private pensions. 37%, and there's no lid. There's no lid to this stuff. So at some point, this needs addressing before it falls over. If you look at Denmark, which is topical at the moment, because Shabana Mahmood has obviously been looking at Denmark. There she is. They've already laid out a plan for pensions to kick in at age 74 by 2075. Now, people will hear that and go, oh, my God, that's terrible or whatever. But just imagine how immeasurably different the world of work will be by 2075 anyway. It's not saying that people are going to be expected to be down the mines, because they're not anymore anyway, or being firemen or police officers or whatever. There will be a transition through, and more experienced, older, especially knowledge workers will be able to be working longer. And in order for the people of today, in order for the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds who are earning good money not to leave the UK and give up on us, they need a sense that they are going to get something back for their massive national insurance contributions that they're now So this
Yeah, but I mean,
needs
it's a difficult issue for governments, Adam, because I lose count of how many French prime ministers have fallen since they tried to institute pensions reform there. And it's really, really hard to do, again, these things that you and I, and pretty much everybody, if you spoke to them, could agree are the right things to do, but politically, very, very hard to implement.
So shall I do my back of the fag packet policy for you? Raise it by a month a year. Right, so you don't suddenly get these cliff edges. You don't get your waspy women situations, right? It's a month every year. I'm sorry about it, but what we're going to do as well is by doing that, we'll be able to give you a bit more when it comes along, right? So that's how it's going to work. It's got to be.
The problem you have is that some government would, leap on that by cancelling it. The next government would change the policy and you wouldn't have made any progress.
And I would simply point to the bond markets and say, well, this is why I never get elected, Duncan, apart from anything else. We all know that. But I would simply point to the bond markets and say, look, get rid of me, put 1% on all your mortgages, lose on your savings, all the rest of it, right? Because the bond markets, I'm telling you now, would love that sort of chat. Fiscal responsibility in the long run.
The reason you never get elected, Adam, is because you're too busy running your property empire. I think while you're doing that, it's going to be much more entertaining for you to work on that than it is to get involved in politics. We do, I am seeing just a little bit of reaction from the bond markets. We were talking about earlier when the OBR released that data. Bond yields did come down quite sharply as prices rose. Therefore, people thinking that is good news. Although that has reversed now since Rachel Reeves has been speaking. So the reaction at the moment is slightly negative.
Interesting. There's always a bit of, an hour or two of speculation. Let's see what happens. Because, like I say, the US, I don't know if there's anything going on in the US from a news point today either, whether that will affect the US bonds and therefore I'm seeing the yields on I watch the 5-year very closely. The 10-year is the economic yardstick, but the 5-year is the mortgage definer, of course. And the 5-year yield is down just a few basis points since 8 a.m. Down about 5 bips at the moment. To root out fraud and error and prevent public money being paid to. But this is largely a budget that's been expected, I think. I mean, it didn't take Nostradamus to put those predictions in that I did that have hit the target ultimately. Though we're still to hear about Help to Buy, of course. From dodgy pandemic spending and contracts.
Yeah, but I mean, they've done that in order to make sure that the reaction from the markets wasn't too steep. I think, Adam, right? They wanted to prepare this because the last thing they wanted was a sharp reaction. Probably I.
Yeah, got a comment about electric cars actually saying we pay more for charging them. I don't know how that really manifests itself, to be honest, because I know when I went from a diesel to an electric, instead of spending £300 a month on diesel, I drive about 25,000 miles a year, something like that, roughly, getting around and about the country. And I went down to spending about 75 quid on charging, and actually a bit less because I've got solar panels. But
it very much depends where you charge, though, doesn't it, Adam? Because if you have a driveway and you can plug in on your house, you've got a great deal. You don't have a driveway, you're plugging in on the street, commercial charges. It's a totally different.
You're totally screwed. I totally agree. Yeah, well, I see the same person's commenting saying he's paying 81 pence per kilowatt, which is usurious. Realistically, that is ridiculous. And you're right. I have seen the terrace streets, or if you're in flats where you don't have parking because you're in a city and all the rest of it. But then ultimately, you've got to survive on Zipcar and things like that, haven't you? They are ridiculous. And I'm surprised that it hasn't been legislated against, to be honest with you, because some of those electric markups are insanity.
So big, right?
Same person says when you got 65, you'll have problems you don't think about. I mean, I think I probably will think about them, but working till you're 70 is ridiculous. But what I would say is, at the end of the day, the population is starting work many years later than it used to. Used to retire at 65, but people started work at 16, and quite a few started before that. Now you've got more than half the population that go to university. So they're not starting in the world of work till they're 21, 22. So you've gained about 7 years there. So at the flip side, at the other end, you are where you are. I appreciate that not everybody goes to university, but ultimately this is about sustainability. It's never going to be popular telling people that you need to be older to draw your pension.
those who can.
I get
But the
that.
nature of work has changed as well, as you're pointing out, Adam. And it's a very different proposition to say you can work from home for a few hours a day when you're 70 to you need to be going, walking the streets and, I don't know, digging
Pick up
holes
the
in the garden.
bins. Yeah,
I mean,
sure. Look, in the pandemic, what did we see apart from anything else? Frontline workers who had to be present to do things, delivery drivers all the way through to nurses and doctors. They got the roughest end of the bargain, ultimately, people who had to see people doing that. I appreciate quite a bit of medical care might change, especially over the next 50 years. But it's always the way that those who are poorer off always take it hardest, regardless of whatever you do.
To make the training for under 25 apprenticeships completely free.
And the disparity in the labour market is another issue which doesn't get talked about enough. But I think, the difference in what different roles are now expected to do is really, really stark. And I think it affects, people's willingness to work and also the compensation that they expect to get for that work.
The Conservatives, the support and the opportunity that they deserve. Guaranteeing every young person a place in college, an apprenticeship, or personalised job support.
I'd love that if it would work, I think that would be wonderful if it would work. But apart from anything else, since the pandemic, we've got a huge issue with the number of people that aren't served well by the school system, whether it's SEN or SEN related.
Not to subsidise the lease on a Mercedes-Benz.
I think this government recognised that the Blair administration made some mistakes with the number of people they expected to try and get to university. That 75% figure is pretty much derided these days as a bit ridiculous, aside from anything else. I'd love to see this actually play out. But the problem that, the primary policy is called the Connect to Work scheme, for anybody who's not aware of it. And they're claiming they're going to bring 300,000 people back into the workforce from long-term disability list. But the intelligent commentary says it'll be more like 50,000 to 100,000 back into the workforce. Nothing like 300,000. And that's from people like the Resolution Foundation, who are on the left, ultimately. So they've not got a dog in the fight to criticise the Labour Party politically.
Voluntary national insurance contributions for people living abroad. Increasing the time that someone has to live or work in Britain to 10 years.
Yeah, you mentioned the universities a couple of times there, Adam, and it will be, I think, very interesting to see if this levy on foreign students come in, because this has basically been the business model of universities, is, bring in foreign students and get them to pay, to subsidise many, UK students who, again, are paying, high fees, but nothing like the cost of most of the degrees that they're doing. And
Duncan, this has absolutely baffled me since I did my MBA, which I hardly ever mention at every opportunity. And I couldn't believe the way that I went in 2012, and it was a 1 year full-time engagement. And there'd been recent changes. Theresa May was the Home Secretary at the time, and there'd been changes to the student visa rules. And basically, the rhetoric was that some people were using student visas as a backdoor to get into the country. But what I saw in a cohort of 71 people, 68 of which were born outside of the UK, and 58 of which were born outside of Europe, right? They came, their fees was something like 30,000 quid. Then they pumped the money they pumped into the local economy. And they came from, largely speaking, pretty wealthy families, right? Exactly the sort of people you would want to attract and stay in the UK. But instead, they all had to leave within some ridiculous length of time, like about 3 months or 6 months afterwards, if they didn't have a job. And the visa application process would take longer than that. So we were getting them in, skinning them for their money, but then getting rid of them when a lot of them would have wanted to stay in London and be highly productive, highly contributory members of the economy. It just didn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a good model, doesn't it? You're basically exporting universities by getting these foreign students to come and bring their money.
The plan to student loan repayments threshold at its 2026-27 level for 3 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that maintaining these thresholds is a decision that will affect working people. I said that.
And the working people. I think we have a gong for that, don't we? Isn't that on your bingo?
She's headed. She did. Yeah, that was a bingo. Yeah. That's hit the gong, Duncan. But she's actually headed off at the pass. What I said earlier on, that would be quoted against her. So she's gone and fallen on her sword instead, which is pretty smart, I think, actually.
The wealthiest contribute the most. The Conservatives knew that our tax system didn't work. Time and time again, they ducked the necessary reforms, leaving a system unfit for a changing economy. with unfairness that they refused to address. Currently, a landlord with an income of £25,000 will pay nearly £1,200 less in tax than their tenants with the same salary.
That is fundamentally true.
No national insurance is charged on property, dividend, or savings income. It's not fair that the tax system treats different types of income so differently. And so I will increase the basic and higher rate of tax on property, savings, and dividend income by 2 percentage points, and the additional rate of tax on property and savings income by 2 percentage points. Even after these reforms, 90% of taxpayers will still pay no tax at all on their savings. As well as narrowing the gap between the tax on income from assets and income from work, I also believe that a fair society is one where the wealthiest pay their fair share.
But what is their fair share, Rachel? They already pay quite a lot.
An additional £8 billion a year by 2020-30 from wealth. I increased taxes last year on private equity, private schools, and private jets. I
want to finish this, not because I think you have a private jet, Adam, but I'd love to bring you back in on the property, but let's just hear a bit more of what she says.
Trust charges and prevent avoidance. I reformed inheritance tax on agricultural and business assets. And this year, I am aligning those reforms with wider inheritance tax rules by allowing the transfer of the 100% relief allowance between spouses, balancing the taxation of these valuable assets with the realities of family life. In this budget, I will take further steps to deal with a long-standing source of wealth inequality in our country. A Band D home in Darlington or Blackpool pays just under £2,400
I'm ready.
in council tax, nearly £300 more than a £10 million mansion in Mayfair. And so, from 2028, I am introducing the high value council tax surcharge in England, an annual £2,500 charge for properties worth more than £2 million, rising to £7,500 for properties worth more than £5 million. This will be collected alongside council tax, levied on owners, and we will consult on options for support or deferral.
I can see the Telegraph headlines already, Duncan.
Will raise over £400 million by 2031 and will be charged on less.
Still have nightmares about writing the Telegraph reports on the live reporting on the budget. Don't bring it back to me.
Reliefs in our tax system cost the taxpayer billions of pounds a year. But many of them no longer.
So 400 million raised by stuff that's worth only over 2 million. Pretty, and £2,500 a year, £200 a month surcharge.
Relieving income tax on all contributions and on.
Let's bring it back to the dividends
yes.
tax. You mentioned 2%, Adam. Is that meaningful to you? Is that going to change the way that you do business?
As I say,
make it more expensive and you carry on and make less money.
When it comes down to it, ultimately, what the perverse incentives that you get in these situations is to take fewer dividends because you don't like the tax rate, and the way that you then end up crystallising the gain in the fullness of time is the money stays within the company, and then when you sell the company, you pay capital gains tax on the shares, right? Of which there is still an element of relief if it's a trading business. If it's a property investment business, you don't get that business asset disposal relief. But if CGT stays at 24%, which she has given her word last year that it would be, and we haven't heard anything on CGT today, and most of the forecasts say if CGT went up, the take would go down. So the 24% looks fairly safe. You might see more money within companies. You might see companies getting bigger. You might see tax take go down, but 2% is not really enough to change behaviour too much, Duncan, I don't think. So what they've done there is, I would advocate for getting rid of employee national insurance altogether, scrap it from 8% down to 0, and put that 8% on the rates, on the basic rate of tax. And then scrap the rates at the higher rate band and the additional band, they're different, but add them on. So there was just income tax, where if the income comes from work or if it comes from something else, tax that income in the same way. She's made that argument and then added a 2% on that's not a big deal.
And one of the big people that groups that will be affected by that will be pensioners, of course, because they don't pay national insurance, but
This
they
is
do
it.
pay income tax on.
This is it.
On
But ultimately, you've got problems with, as I say, some of these DB schemes, some of these defined benefit schemes, final salary jobs, where we need to be collecting as much tax off those as we possibly can. So it is unfortunate. You could have a personal allowance for people who are over 67, if that's what you wanted to do. That was enhanced. That would go some way towards taking in some of that. But it's not the pensioners on 10, 15 and 20k that you want to target. It's the pensioners on 40k plus who shouldn't be getting a break at the time when they're ultimately putting the most stress on the resources of the state, in my opinion. And as I say, can see from the comments today, it's not a very popular opinion. But I would say that whether I was 47, 67 or 87, because I'm inherently try to be fair about these things.
Yeah, but you've got to be speaking to your audience, Adam. It seems like you're falling the wrong side of your audience here, and they're going to vote with their feet and leave you. So you stick by your opinions, you pay the price.
Yeah, and I'm willing to do that. That's why the bond markets would love me.
Lowest rates since 1991. Paid for through higher rates on properties worth more than £500,000, like the warehouses used by online giants.
Business rate revaluation.
Yeah, that's been a big deal for a long time. Yeah, effective. Does that sound effective to you, Adam?
Well, there's definitely been a big shift in. I mean, retail rates are far too high. Industrial rates are far too low. So it does make sense.
That 500,000 figure, do you think that's reflective of the difference between the cost of a high street property compared with the cost of a giant warehouse?
Yeah, I mean, outside of your Camden High Streets and the likes, realistically, you're not going to be having any sort of rateable values touching anything like that in a small mum and dad shop, a cafe, a restaurant, and people who need relief. So let's see what the
small market towns that have been hollowed out that I guess that they're particularly focused on.
Because all cars contribute to the wear and tear on our roads, I will ensure that drivers are taxed according to how much they drive and not just by the type of car they own, by introducing the electric vehicle excise duty on electric cars. This will be payable each year alongside vehicle excise duty at 3p per mile for electric.
Well, another Rachel Reeves policy that's popular with Adam Lawrence and unpopular with all the people watching.
Us to double road maintenance funding in England over
You're racking them up.
Look at that, doubling road maintenance funding though, and the roads are in a bloody terrible state. They are.
The roads need investment.
Boost our British car industry. Increasing the threshold for the expensive car supplement on electric vehicles to £50,000, saving over 1 million motorists £440 a year. Providing £1.3 billion additional funding for the electric car grant, extending it to 2030 and taking total funding.
It's going to be really interesting to see what behaviour it drives, because a lot of people are not going to like this 3 pence a mile. They're not going to like it.
In addition,
it won't be rationally approached. This won't at all. It'll be really. I can't wait to see the next 6 months of car sales.
Well, I mean, also it's going to be very complicated for hybrid cars, because if you drive a hybrid car and you only drive it for short journeys, you're on electric almost all the time. If you drive a hybrid car and you mainly do long journeys, you're on petrol almost all the time. How are they going to factor that in? It's going to be an absolute nightmare calculation.
I wonder what they're going to do. I wonder what they're going to do. These things, the complication in the way you collect these things is always a factor, you know.
Because the costs of collecting them can be very high. They're going to have to monitor, how far have you driven in the last year.
Yeah, your MOT
payments people who've not driven as far as they thought. Imagine, those putting those checks in the post or whatever. The complexity of that.
It's fine by the MOT system for anything that's over 3 years old, of course. But of course, most of these electric vehicles aren't.
I will not converge towards a single rate. But I will prevent.
You're going to have somebody coming into your car every year just to check your mileage,
Tax avoidance in the current structure. I will today publish Ray McCann's report into the loan charge, along with the government's response, setting out a new settlement opportunity that will finally allow people to finalise their position and draw a line under this long-standing issue. And I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Milton Keynes Central, for her representations on this subject. I will continue with the planned uprating for tobacco duties that I set out last year. And
always going to be the case.
Duties by inflation.
Easy win.
along
We haven't heard about the gambling duty yet, have we, either? But we've known it's coming for some time.
2026 and changes to the soft drinks industry levy announced by my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, yesterday. And I'd like to thank the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury for his work on all the tax measures in this budget. I will also reform gambling taxes in
Here we go.
response to the rise in online gambling. Remote gaming is associated with the highest levels of harm. And so I am increasing remote gaming duty from 21% to 40%.
Ooh.
With duty
That's
on
the
online
change
betting
that will be
increasing
felt.
from 15% to 25%. I am making no change to the taxes on in-person gambling or on horse racing. And I am abolishing bingo duty entirely from April next year.
Now, you
Well,
remember I said my wife worked on the Treasury budget. Bingo duty was her project. So her legacy has now been erased under Gordon
Yeah,
Brown.
we dancing in Mecca tonight. Yeah, great.
Of the tax reforms I have made today, I can confirm that I will not be increasing national insurance, the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax, or...
This is the, we're keeping our manifesto pledges.
Yeah. Working people aren't paying anymore.
No. As long as they don't drive electric cars, own
Save
property.
money, or dare to own any shares that they want you to own so that you can support the UK. Perfectly circuitous argument, Duncan.
On the day I became Chancellor, I said that I would judge my time in office a success if I knew that ordinary children from working class backgrounds were living more fulfilling lives. Their horizons expanded, their potential realised. I joined the Labour Party, I came into politics because I believe that every child has equal worth and deserves an equal chance to achieve their promise. The biggest barrier to equal opportunity is child poverty. Because for every child...
You can see her talking to her own MPs here, can't you? I mean, this is very, very much talking to her base.
She's really changed. She really changed her rhetoric there, hasn't she? Here comes the 2-child limit.
Or in another B&B. While other children enjoy the advantages of parents with time to help with homework.
I was actually really touched by... I went to the Labour Party conference last year. I didn't bother so much this year, but I went last year to get a flavour of what's going on to the fringe housing events and things like that. And the number of Labour MPs in the housing department who were brought up in temporary accommodation or had some time in temporary accommodation as children gives them a really... And I thought, actually, to a man and woman, they were completely reasonable and fair and very balanced about their ideas about housing. And I was very positive about that side of things. The issue is more on the business / property developer / regulatory side of things, where they just don't have any experience whatsoever, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then, you know, there is a big divide in the backgrounds of our politicians, aren't there? Depending which party you get really different life experiences, which can bring pros and cons.
Yeah, absolutely.
Since last July, we've rolled out free breakfast clubs in schools. We're expanding free school meals to 500,000 more kids.
Yeah, these policies are very controversial, aren't they? Because very easy to announce, but then if the funding's not there, get left on the providers to fill the gaps and to explain to parents why they can't have the promises that the Chancellor's made.
Yeah. Because there is one policy that pushes kids into poverty more than any other.
Here it is.
It was introduced by the party opposite.
Here's the shouting.
They said it would save money and that it would bring about behavioural change, disincentivising poorer families from having more children. Well, even on its own terms, it failed. The welfare bill has continued to rise, and there's been no difference in the size of families. But what it has done is to push hundreds of thousands of children up.
I'm not sure what difference in the size of families the government is trying to engineer here. They're trying to engineer smaller families, because I thought that would be a concern for them, perhaps.
I think what she was suggesting was it didn't change behaviour and it didn't mean that families got smaller. But I agree with you. It's extremely damaging for families. Families haven't got smaller, but the number of people having children has got smaller. And this is the depopulation problem, which is a huge demographic issue. And we've got about 10 or 15 years here of the 20 to 35-year-old population expanding quite significantly due to the demographics that we've got. But then since COVID and the drastic suppression in the birth rate, there's a huge issue after that. So you definitely don't. But around the world, South Korea are probably the pinnacle of trying to deal with this, because their children per female is so low. It's extremely down. And they've tried some pretty incredible policies, and in Scandinavia and all the rest of it. And there's no reversing this trend. This trend is not reversing.
And I think, to be honest, I think that we should not necessarily be trying to reverse it. We should be saying, how do we deal with this? And like you said, the pension scheme is just massive.
Correct.
And
the triple lock is a joke, Duncan. It's from a sensible perspective, the triple lock is a joke. You could knock 0.1% off the bond yields by getting rid of it like that. And that would save everybody money. Ironically enough, it would save money. But there we go.
And so because I am tackling fraud and error in our welfare system, because I am cracking down on tax avoidance, because I am reforming gambling taxation, I can announce today, fully costed and fully funded, the removal of the 2-child limit in full from April.
Pushing.
Lots of paper waving. Although this idea of we can fund it from the amount that we get from saving from fraud, I think every chancellor, every budget announces that their savings from fraud is going to allow them to fund, some brilliant projects.
It's never not happened. You're quite right, my friend. Never not happened. Although, again, it's one of those things that perhaps Labour haven't drawn as much political capital out of it as they would have liked. But they have done raids on shops employing illegal workers. They have made some progress in that department, it seems. It certainly seems to me to have had a bit more airtime than it did during the Conservative government. But of course, COVID took everything over in the last few years, so perhaps that's an unfair comparison anyway.
Although I think it's that less visible fraud that is what really costs the Chancellor, isn't it? It's people who aren't paying tax, on much more
small business compliance has been a huge problem since COVID. Huge problem.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I know how worried families are about the cost of everything. Worried that their money won't stretch to the end of the month. Worried that price... I think if you've got a house that's worth £5 million a year, you can probably afford it. But you get more exercise about reducing child poverty than you do about the richest paying more.
Passionate stuff from Rachel there.
By more since we were elected than in 10 years under the last government.
Well, I think for any of these politicians, the challenge they have is they probably all have houses which are worth well in excess of what their average constituents could ever imagine.
Well, absolutely.
But I know that people.
But of course, they're on triple the medium wage, although I'm an advocate of it not being high enough, apart from anything else.
No.
We are doing it. Extending the bus fare cap, cracking down on rip-off price hikes, freezing prescription charges, and freezing.
Yeah, I've made a post about this morning because they're kind of saying like we've frozen rail fares and prescription charges, making the cost of living cheaper. It's like, no, it's just not making it more expensive. You do understand how you haven't put the cost down, right?
In real terms, Adam.
Yeah, well, that's not an argument they ever want to bring up, is it? Let's face it.
No, because nobody goes out and pays for things in real terms, do they? They don't say, how much will this cost me in real terms when they go into the shops and,
Exactly.
pick up their medicine.
Last year, I increased the national minimum wage and the national living wage, and I am doing the same this year too. Accepting the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission in full, and increasing the minimum wage for 18 to 20-year-olds from £10 to £10.85 an hour. And increasing
that is a big one, isn't it? That is a big measure.
Chunky, 8.5%. It's very, very chunky.
And, of course, it sends messages to other parts of the public sector, doesn't it, about what kind of pay rises are normal and acceptable and they should be going for.
It pertains back to what I said earlier about the minimum wage really being in the market now from an economic lever perspective. You know, there's a lot of the civil service is caught by these minimum wage rises, and it costs a huge amount to the government aside from anything else. But it's been the only driver of economic growth in the last year or so. Government spending, a little bit of investment. Investment has been good over the last 12 months, don't get me wrong. I think they have done quite a good job with courting more people, although at the cost of being called never hear Keir or whatever. And the problems that you can't necessarily trust what they're going to do over employment taxes. And employment rights is the next cliff edge that's hanging over all of this, Duncan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the greatest drivers of the rising cost of living is the cost of energy prices. The cause of high
This will be interesting.
Must be
is it the levy or is it the VAT?
So we are investing in energy security, in nuclear and renewable
You see David?
energy,
You see Ed Miliband anywhere
through our warm homes plan.
in the shop?
There he is.
That's not enough when people are struggling with energy bills today. The Conservatives' eco scheme was presented as a plan to tackle fuel poverty. It costs households £1.7 billion a year on their bills. And for 97% of families in fuel poverty, the scheme, get this, has cost them more than it's saved. It is a failed scheme, and so I am scrapping it, along with taking other legacy costs off bills. And as a result, I can tell you today that for every family, we are keeping our promise to get energy bills down and cut the cost of living. With £150 cut from the average household bill from April next year.
So scrapping the energy company obligation, that's very, very interesting.
In the pockets of working people, that is my choice.
Although the problem with these promises about cutting energy bills is the government doesn't set energy bills, and they can do their best, but the markets ultimately are going to decide whether people pay higher energy costs or not, regardless of what Rachel Reeves would like to have.
And in the future, that is the Labour choice. And Madam Deputy Speaker, one more thing. Because of our action on bills and on prices, as a direct result of this budget, the Office for Budget Responsibility confirmed today that inflation is coming down.
Confirmed today a little bit earlier than I'd like you
to. Along with the complete spoiler of the whole budget.
That's the benefit of a Labour government cutting the cost of living.
I mean, it's very brave to be bringing inflation up when you forced inflation up by putting employers' national insurance up quite as much as they did. I mean, it's very, very brave. It looks economically illiterate, to be honest. It's just silly, silly political point scoring.
Well, there's several inflation increasing measures in this budget, aren't there, with the minimum wage as well.
I have asked everyone to contribute, yes. Yeah. For the security of our country and the brightness of its future.
Energy bills, for once, though, they've got that. They've actually done something fairly smart there. But of course, the problem, what she's not said, is that money is used to fund improvements to housing, which is the biggest chance they have to get towards net zero. So how that's going to be replaced or whether it's going to be funded from general taxation, I doubt they've scrapped the energy company obligations altogether. It'll just be in a different form. But taking it away from the household bill is actually a very good idea, I think.
Money off bills and prices frozen, all while keeping every single one of.
Do you know what I haven't heard? I haven't heard defence. You know, defence has been a word. Countries all around the world.
We talked about frigates a little bit, didn't we? And that was about it. Yeah.
Order. Mr. Rankin, Miss Morton, your voice carries right across the chamber. Right across the chamber.
I'd like to think that'd be me if I was in there, getting told off for being particularly loud.
Yeah, your voice would carry across the chamber, Adam. It's a very small chamber, but yeah, your voice will certainly dominate it, I think.
Not austerity, not reckless borrowing, but cutting the debt, cutting waiting.
But as we said, you know, you've got no time for politics. It's not where you're going to go. You'd much rather sit here and tell them what they should do, and then do the
much
real
easier,
work.
Isn't it? Much easier.
And Madam Deputy Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Well, she's not done badly there in her delivery, given that the whole thing was absolutely, robbed from underneath her by what happened at the OBR this morning.
Yeah, I think but the problem is not many people are actually going to watch that speech, are they, Adam?
No, they're not.
And most of the ones that do will be on this channel listening to us, I'm sure. But that isn't really the yardstick by which we measured. The yardstick could be, what is the follow-up? How is this received?
What will the people feel, Duncan? The electric car owners, which is not the bottom 40% of income earners as a general rule, they can't afford them, like they don't have them, or they haven't got somewhere to plug them in, as you correctly said earlier on. They do pay energy bills, right? And the scheme, what will get made out of that is that will save more money for people who have larger energy bills. But still, if you can take a couple of £100 off the price cap, if that works out in the way that she said, 150, 200 quid, that's going to be a meaningful saving. That money will go on their council tax next year, pretty much, or certainly half of it. But they've had a big water rise this year. There shouldn't be another one of those next year, hopefully. People will feel it a little bit.
Today and on the succeeding days. The questions on this motion and on the remaining motions we put at the end of the budget.
But there's a lot of long-term problems that haven't been touched on there again. We social care we talk about every year. What's going to happen with that? We heard some words about the NHS. Didn't really feel like there was a solution to the absolute crisis, frankly, that it is in at the moment. There are many
case, isn't it, Duncan, in these
unresolved, unsaid subjects. Yeah.
What will be interesting is what didn't make it into the speech that's then gone. They're going to try and slide it under the carpet in the broader theme of things, which will include some of what you just said, I'm sure.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I congratulate the Right Honourable Lady on delivering her second budget. I hope she enjoyed it, because it really should be her last. What a total humiliation. A total humiliation.
Can colleagues who are exiting the chamber do so swiftly so we can focus on the leader of the opposition? Swiftly exit, quietly. Right. Leader of the opposition.
It's funny to imagine how these guys haven't got a chance to listen to, the whole budget. They've come all the way in, and it's going to take them 10 minutes, and they have to leave. Maybe they're hoping to catch the end of your summary, Adam.
She promised that she wouldn't be back.
You're on the mobile right now, Dan.
She swore it was a one-off. She told everyone that from now on it would be stability and she would pay for everything with growth. Today, she has broken every single one of those promises. If she had any decency, she would resign.
Ooh, calling for the Chancellor to resign.
She said she was proud to be the country's first ever female Chancellor. After this budget, she will go down as the country's worst ever Chancellor.
This is
I'm not sure that position's available at this time. No, we've got to. That's a bit of
moderation. The worst ever Chancellor. That is doing it something, isn't it?
There's just not that much in there, is there?
Knows that we don't allow clapping in the chamber. Leader of the opposition.
Today she has announced a new tax rate of £26 billion. They're all cheering. Household income is down. Spending policies in this budget increase borrowing in every year. That smorgasbord of misery we just heard from her can be.
EFO's back up on the OVR website now as well, having been yanked earlier on, but it's now back up for consumption.
This is a budget for Benefit Street, Madam Deputy Speaker, paid for.
I do feel for the fat finger on the bottom.
Someone's got a minor ticking off there, haven't they?
I think more than a minor one.
Taxes on workers, pensioners, and savers to pay for handouts.
This is highly market-sensitive information. People have made a lot of money and lost a lot of money because of that.
Totally agree.
Same backbenchers, Madam Deputy Speaker, who cheered last year when she taxed jobs and left more than 100,000 people without an income. They cheered because they didn't understand the consequences of what they were doing, and they still don't. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not been an easy time for the Chancellor. No one liked seeing her sitting on those benches as it dawned on her that her own backbenchers were going to do to her political career what she's done to our economy. But she could have chosen today to bring down welfare spending and get more people into work. Instead, she has chosen to put up tax after tax after tax, taxes on workers, taxes on savers, taxes on pensioners, taxes on investors, taxes on homes, holidays, cars, I think even milkshakes, taxes on anyone doing the right thing.
That's the lowest
She
hanging
and
fruit
his
there,
government
isn't
have
it,
lost
really?
what little credibility they had left, and no one will ever trust her again. What's amazing, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that she has the nerve to come to this House and claim this is all someone else's fault. A laundry list of excuses. Yeah. Yes. Madam Deputy Speaker,
I do think she's a good speaker, Badenoch, I must say.
Into the Treasury under the cover of darkness to give pay
Yeah,
rises to the
she's
unions.
strong.
She inherited an economy with inflation at 2% and record high employment. She has tanked it in just over a year.
Well, that's really not true. I mean, you know,
Well, both tank the economy. The Conservatives and Labour have both tanked the economy, and here we are looking at 1.5% growth. Okay?
Exactly.
Maybe stunning, but it's not really a collapse, is it?
Inflation is up,
No.
not down, and that inflation was stoked by her tax and spend decisions.
Now that's
The
true.
economic
Now
More on the
that's
outlook
that's
says that they
unmistakably
expect
true.
inflation to stay higher for longer. Everybody else has read it. She still hasn't read the OBR analysis. She blames higher than expected borrowing costs. Where does she think they came from? Those borrowing costs are driven by her.
Well, the amount of index-linked gilts that have been issued and inflation being out of control in both parties can bear equal responsibility for that, Kemi, I'm afraid.
At any point under the 14 years of Conservative government. Perhaps if Labour MPs read a book sometimes, they would know something.
Oh, intellectual snobbery at its best. Jolly good, Kemi, jolly good.
But nobody reads books anymore, Adam. It's all about the TikTok.
What is her excuse?
It's all about listening to YouTube, right?
She is taking the public for fools, but they are under no illusions whose fools.
Although when our book comes out next week, we do recommend everybody buy it.
Bad choices she is making today.
Oh, natural.
Choices to break promises, choices to put up taxes, choices to spend more of other people's money are because of the bad choices she made at the last disastrous budget. If you want growth, you need
To an extent, I think that's a pretty fair challenge.
Country you want to be, and make a plan to get there. Create certainty for the people and businesses who will drive growth. There is no
Yeah, and she has created elements of certainty in pockets, which is quite frustrating, really, to an extent.
Scratching the itches they had in opposition. She promised stability. She delivered chaos. Just look at the circus around this budget. First the leaks, then more leaks to try to undo the damage. Calling panicky press conferences, U-turning on her U-turns, rolling the pitch one day only to plow through it the next. She had the cheek to talk about stability, Madam Deputy Speaker. She has become the first Chancellor in history to release the whole budget ahead of time. This is extraordinary. It tells you everything you need to know about her grip on the Treasury. She's making the
very, very unlucky for Rachel Reeves that, and he's gonna stick.
She should sure as hell.
I wonder if he'll get. And I was listening to some analysis this morning that was saying what Rachel Reeves has had that's helped her is the fact that Starmer is now so unpopular. And I wonder if she'll get a bit of sympathy there, because whatever you think of Rachel Reeves, it can't be deemed to be her fault that that leak has happened from the OBR. It can't be. And I wonder if there's an element of sympathy in that.
But it's seen to be the government, isn't it, Adam? It's it's this monolithic government that can't do anything, regardless of which member of the government, and the difference between the civil service and the political parts of the government. It's a government failing.
The credibility of the Chancellor, and not just down through the floor.
It's like a pantomime, right?
Does she really think that
that's what you get for having the budget so late. It's nearly Christmas season, isn't it? So, oh no, she didn't. Oh yes, she did. Yes, she did.
Today, she had an opportunity to apologize and show some humility. Instead, we've been fed puff pieces in the Times and the FT, showing a woman wallowing in self-pity, whining about mansplaining and misogyny. Madam Deputy Speaker,
I thought she might go for this.
Let me explain.
I really upset some people by putting a post on LinkedIn about this, because objectively it does seem to me, and I'm not someone who would call this out on a normal day at all, that there has been an element of misogyny in what's happened. But of course, Badenoch is immune because she's a woman, so she can say whatever she thinks about this. But you know,
Of course,
objectively,
our day in the Commons is dominated by three women: the Speaker and the Leader of the Opposition and the Chancellor.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I saw your post. It was very interesting. I would recommend people go back and have a look at that, because you do get into the difference between what is misogynistic and what is effectively playing the ball and fair comment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Real equality.
And it's a shame that Badenoch hasn't gone down that route really as well, because I think it's the only fair way to address the question.
Standard as everyone else. It means being judged on results. Take her bright idea, the Office for Value for Money. It's been closed down because it didn't save a penny.
That was rather silly. Like Doge, though, really. So good it got closed down. Yeah.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've identified a way to save taxpayers huge amounts of money by sacking just one person, the woman sitting opposite.
That's clever. That's clever.
The chief economist of the Bank of England was not mansplaining. He wasn't mansplaining when he said the uncertainty around today's budget is the single biggest reason growth has flatlined.
That's definitely not wrong.
Think would happen when she went on breakfast telly to do an emergency public service announcement. I interrupt your Cheerios to bring you this frightening message about income tax. And then, unbelievably...
I don't approve of ad hominem as a general rule, but that's pretty good delivery. Oh, that's good faces, though. Good poker faces from the opposition front bench. She should be better than that, though, Babe. Not really. She is better than that. She's intellectually better than that.
And there's plenty of material she can actually go for. But I think, you know, the U-turn on income tax is a legitimate target. Right? I mean, again, contributes to this idea of a sort of shambles of a government that doesn't really know what they're doing. We're gonna prepare everyone to raise income tax, and then they're not actually going to bite the bullet and do it, having done all the damaging work.
She says she wants
rightful criticism.
Respect is earned. She apparently told Labour MPs this week. I'll show the media, I'll show the Tories, I will not let them beat me. Show us what? Making stuff up at the dispatch box, incompetence, chaos, and the highest tax burden in history. She said to them, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll be there on Wednesday, I'll be there next year, and I'll be back the year after that. God help us. She is spineless, shameless, and completely aimless. Talk to any business. Talk to someone looking for a job. Unemployment is up every single month since Labour have been in office. They don't want to hear it, but it's true. They're shouting and complaining they cannot create jobs. It is the worst year for graduate recruitment on record. Are they proud of this? Companies like Merck and Ineos slashing investment plan.
Order. If you're on the front bench, I can obviously see you, Mr. Kyle. And there's no need for you to be chuntering this loud. They can see and hear you as well. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. They don't want to hear the truth, but I'm speaking for all of those people out there who are sick of this government. Companies like Merck and Ineos are slashing investment plans. The construction sector has shrunk. How is that house building target going, by the way? I'll tell you, Madam Deputy Speaker, they are miles behind and won't even come close to what we achieved. Business confidence is at record lows. No wonder
well, that's a low bar, isn't it?
Has been revised down in every year of the scorecard. The papers are reporting that 1 in 8 business leaders is planning to leave Britain. Even one of Labour's biggest ever.
1 in 8 business leaders is planning to leave Britain. I mean, just as a quick fact check on that, seems unlikely.
I think as far as surveys of intention go, they're weak at the best of times. And that's, I happen to ask, you know, a few people at a gathered wealth management specialist for leaving the country event at lunchtime or something like that, and that's how you get a number like that. I'm not sure.
That would be a big deal.
Today, she has raised the dividend tax rate.
You're going to leave the country for 7. I can imagine the chat in the Treasury. Are you leaving the country for $7.5 grand extra tax a year on your £5 million house? You know, I'm only fortunate enough to know about 2 or 3 people who live
my shares in buy shares in the ferry companies and the airlines, because, or the trans-channel removal companies, because they're going to be doing some big business.
People who work hard and save hard to buy their homes get taxed more, while those who don't work, who in some cases refuse to work, get their accommodation paid for by taxpayers. And then to top it all off, because taxing your home, your car, your savings, and your pension wasn't enough, she has, by her own admission, broken her manifesto promise on income tax. Because in the last budget, she said, and I quote, "I am keeping every single promise on tax that I made in our manifesto, so there will be no extension
Fantastic
of
comments,
the freeze
Adam.
in income tax thresholds." She said in that budget
We
that
need to
extending
rename the
threshold
podcast.
freeze would hurt working people and take money out of their payslips. But today, she has done exactly that. Why should anyone believe anything she's promised in this budget? And so where is the money going? Small changes to rail fares and prescriptions, these are distractions while she steals your wallet. The real story here, Madam Deputy Speaker, the real story.
I have to say, your
is
cell
that
looks a bit
Labour
more
have
commodious than
lost
mine, though,
control
Adam.
of
Definitely coming
welfare
to your
spending.
prison next
Not
for the
only
rest
have
of
Open,
myself.
open prison, Duncan. Open prison.
Frozen while benefits go up in line with inflation. Not only have Labour abandoned reforms that would have saved the taxpayer £5 billion after pressure from these backbenchers, today they have added another £3 billion to the bill by scrapping the two-child benefit cap. We introduced
But
that
we haven't heard
plan,
anything. We
Madam
didn't hear
Deputy
anything about
Speaker,
prisons, did we, Adam? I
because
mean,
it means people
that's
are
another
more
area
likely to
where,
have to make the
desperately
same
needed
decision
investment.
about
Money
having
really,
children as
really
everyone else.
in short
Even
supply.
Labour voters
All
know
kinds of
that in
problems
spite
going
of
on
the
there,
right
which we've been
balance
hearing
of
about,
supporting
over and
people
over
who
again,
are
and
struggling
nothing
and
really in
protecting
that speech about
taxpayers
how
who
that
are
could be addressed.
struggling
The justice system,
themselves.
same as
Just
It's
defence.
also been a deep
the
source
Chancellor
of
admitted
real frustration for
lifting
me
the
that they
two-child
appointed
benefit
James
cap was
Timpson
not
and seemed to have
difficult.
done absolutely
That was
nothing with him.
before the Prime
I thought it
Minister
was one of the really
accidentally fired
positive
a
things that
starter gun
happened
on the race to
at
replace
the
her.
start of the
So now the
administration,
King
and
and the
thought I'd like to
Chancellor
see a bit of
are
this
buying the votes
realistically.
of their own
And I haven't,
MPs
and he's
with
quite a vocal
taxpayers'
person. You
money.
hear him on the radio
If she wants to
around and
reduce
about
child poverty,
occasionally.
she should stop
Speaks
taxing
very,
their
very
parents and
well.
stop destroying
Runs
their
a great
kids.
business, great societal values in his business.
Congratulated herself.
I was so
Yeah.
positive about that appointment, and we've just had nothing at all. Nothing at all.
But it's about these margins, like I was saying with the councils. They got no money to spend. Your horizon for what you can do is so limited. I mean, what's the point of coming up with great schemes? Because ultimately, if it costs any money, you're just going to get told you can't do it. And
Yeah.
frankly, as you know from running your business, there's some things that you can do at low cost. There's a lot of things you can't do without investing.
Nobody voted
Fair,
for this.
fair.
The Chancellor must take responsibility.
Treasury runs the country
She
at the end of the
chose
day.
to impose the jobs tax, driving unemployment higher month after month. She chose to abandon welfare reform, meaning the benefits bill is spiraling. She chose to spend more and more money she didn't have, leaving taxpayers to foot the bill. She is out of money, out of ideas, out of her depth, and she has run out of road. The country simply cannot afford a chancellor who can't keep her own promises. Her position is untenable, and she knows it. She's talking to the chancellor. Is he mansplaining to you, by the way?
I mean, I've always thought this is probably one of the easiest speeches to deliver, because you've got three here, and there's so many different targets that have just been unveiled, because normally governments are so cautious about, revealing detail, because they know that they do that, they get hit on it. And I think for the leader of the opposition, this must be your ideal day to be able to, get a big prominent platform and basically just to be able to hit and hit and hit.
Yeah.
It's Turkish, isn't it?
The overarching promise was not coming back for tax rises, and she's right in what she says, babe. There's a dozen plus tax rises. Yes, they're all little nibbles here and there, but they're all nibbles. The only political capital really on tax the rich, which is if you're going to try and deal with Polanski and the Greens, right? What have you done? The mansion tax. The mansion tax is going to raise 400 million quid. Now the Greens don't talk about the numbers side of it, because numbers don't work for their sorts of policies. So they've done a tiny thing, haven't they?
Let me tell the Chancellor something.
Yeah, and ultimately, like you said, I mean, you could have taken one big hit on raising income tax and not had to do all these small things that are going to, hurt various different constituencies.
And they have every reason.
And it doesn't really fix the problem in nearly the same way, does it? Because you're just going to come around again this time next year and have the same issues, and just tinker and tinker and tinker.
Yeah, there is a chance, you know, this. I mean, now that the OBR is down to more realistic growth forecasts, aside from anything else, and there is a level of certainty. The problem is, can a business now plan for the next 3 to 5 years, or can they only plan for 12 months, Duncan? That'll be part of the big problem, because are we just going to have the same again? What will Labour learn from this in terms of the timing, in terms of the comms leaks, in terms of all of that? Or are we just going to have another, oh my goodness moment, unless we hear from the OBR that actually things are going better than expected and we're not going to have a black hole this time around? There's a 50-50 chance of another black hole, ultimately, next year.
And as a business, Adam, how much does that affect you? I mean, how much is it just a case of I'll ignore the noise and get on with things? And how much is it a case of saying, actually, these policies have real life impact on me, and I'm not going to take decisions ahead of a budget, or I'm not going to make big purchases if I know that there's something around the corner?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And really, apart from anything else, this is a real economist's answer here, you can tell, but I do run multiple businesses, as you know. It really depends on price elasticity. Because in rental property, if you put the price up £100, and I don't mean you on your own, I mean the market. If the market puts rent up £100, demand does not fall by very much at all, because it's essential that people have got rental property and they've got a roof over their heads. If you run a retail business, let's say it was a bakery or something like that, then it's all about price sensitivity. And if you can't eat quite a bit of the increased cost of employers' national insurance going up, for example, your margins will be lower. That's what's happened across that sort of sector this year. And that manifests itself in even Greggs have stopped their seriously aggressive expansion that they've been doing, you know, because they can't get around these staff costs and things like that. So they need to decide whether it's permanent or whether it's temporary. The big decision that was made, and what was smart about the employers' national insurance rise, was it was made clear that was a one-off. But how much, 4.7 billion coming from salary sacrifice on employer, a lot of that will be from employer national insurance contributions. So it's another 4.7 billion that's been found on the back of it. So last year, 25 billion. It's only 20% the size or a bit less of last year's rise. But it's another one when we were told there wasn't going to be another one. So how much can you pass on is always going to be a big factor. What's your price elasticity is what it comes down to. And therefore, what's the point of investing more money back into the business in order to grow if the margins are just smaller and smaller? Are you just going to go into defensive mode, try and prepare the business for sale, take advantage of that CGT rate, like I said, rather than pay more dividend tax to extract money out of it?
Yeah, so I took from you that your perspective on this budget, from your personal business perspective, is, this is something we just have to work around. We will find, maybe we will change the way we do some things, but fundamentally, it's going to make things less interesting for us. But ultimately, it's not going to change the landscape fundamentally. If you're a landlord,
I think that's correct, but it's where it stops people coming in rather than, so as a landlord. So new landlords are less likely to look at property. I've had a few people message this week saying, well, we looked at going into property, but the numbers don't work anymore. And I would tend to agree with them as a general rule, unless you're going to adopt a particular, you're going to need to get some advantage from somewhere. You need competitive advantage. Years ago, you could buy property and know that it was probably going to go up in value, and it was all going to be fine. Capital growth was going to look after you. That's changed. The interest rates materially changed. The compliance landscape has changed. The risk landscape has changed. The effort landscape has changed. And 2% more is another reason not to get involved in the first place. The people already there will hold on to assets probably, although a lot were already thinking about disposing anyway. But it's the people not coming in that doesn't, the organic wastage goes out of the market and it doesn't get replaced by people coming in.
So the really big guys are going to be okay. It's those people who are thinking of starting up that are going to find it more difficult. Adam, I think we should pull out of the live now and perhaps just do a summary, because unless you want to carry on going on your own, I have to go and go out to the prison yard to do my exercise.
Well, you've only got half an hour a day, haven't you? So you've got to make the most of it.
I missed that. Yeah. It's all for the day. So I was wondering perhaps if we could do just two parts of the of your summary. One, perhaps a general summary of what we've seen and the points that you think are the key points, and then perhaps the second one, particularly around property. So, I mean, do you want to tell us what you feel is the key things from that budget, just from a general economic business perspective?
Yeah, so there is an element of slight addressing of the cost of living and a little bit of disinflationary stuff in there due to the movement away from household bills. It is in the smorgasbord of the tax system one way or another. So it's still the money's still being raised for things like energy company obligation. I'm sure it's not gone away, but disinflationary will give the Bank of England, I would think, the confidence to be able to cut rates again in December when they meet on the back of it. Not inflationary stuff in there particularly. Look, we're going to see 4%-ish on salaries and things like that next year. That's going to bump into continuing increases in terms of prices, whatever can be passed on towards consumers, what we were just talking about in terms of price elasticity and things like that. So we're probably looking, I'd be surprised if we get under 3% inflation by the end of 2026. Unemployment-wise, I still haven't heard anything that gives me any confidence they're arresting the trend or are really putting enough effort into creating jobs and things like that. Little bit of if we move over to the property focus, ultimately the business rates side, we need to see some detail on that, but it looks like a little bit of progress made aside from anything else. Didn't hear about Help to Buy. Mansion tax-wise, mostly a political exercise, the mansion tax. I don't think anyone in a £2 million house at £200 a month. There will be examples that come out of the woodwork, but there'll be zero violins for anybody who lives in a property that's worth over £2 million anyway. So they seem to have pitched that at the right sort of level. But I think the most important thing really is, once again, the more tax thing, whether the 2% is really the point or whether it's a straw that breaks the camel's back, Duncan, we're going to see more and more disposals than we otherwise would have done, right? And we're going to see fewer and fewer buyers in the market, although they might be bigger buyers who've got much more muscle. And this is the corporates coming in and taking over the private rental sector, or at least taking a big bite out of that apple before the end of this parliament. And have we just seen what's likely symptomatic of the other budgets there are to come this parliament, if they're delivered by Rachel Reeves, of course, which is the jury is still going to remain out on. So overall, for property owners, it's not great news, but it's a nibble. It's a nibble here, a nibble there, and a nibble elsewhere. For people running hospitality businesses, it's not great. Short-term rental businesses, we'll have to see how that all shakes down. And for anyone who drives around the country in an electric vehicle because it's a tax-efficient way to get money out of their company, we all seem to have been caught out a little bit on that one as well, folks. So very few people will be better off from that, and ultimately the asset owners are going to pick up, and the savers are picking up a fair amount of the tab, Duncan, as we expected.
There was one thing I wanted to ask you, Adam. When they talk about £2 million houses, how do they establish what is a £2 million house?
Well, this will be part of the great question, because there's going to need to be a revaluation. So you mentioned revaluations, didn't you? How will that be done? We'll have to see.
That's potentially quite a big deal for somebody if their house is, they've got a big house.
If you're on the cusp, well, what you'll see cliff edges where someone puts their house up. They would have put it up at 2.2, but ultimately they're going to list it at 1.999 now in order to be under the threshold, and offers around. And
this isn't just about selling houses, though, is it? This is the council tax rate, if I understood right.
No, absolutely. But what I'm saying is, if someone's going to buy a house and thinking, well, if I pay that, then I'm going to be under. House, yeah. Where's the evidence? Well, I paid less than £2 million for it. Yeah. I mean, remember when you're buying houses at that level, you're paying over 100 grand in stamp duty anyway, right? So how much it jams up the market is questionable at £2,500 a year. They've probably pitched it low enough to get enough people in scope, but it's mostly been for political point scoring, the mansion tax.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm going to just leave on my favourite comment from the day from Ian Clark, which is, shut up, I want to hear what she's got to say. So, Ian, thanks very much for your thoughts. Everybody else, thanks for joining us, and hopefully your more positive reactions. It's been a pleasure. We will be back hopefully next week with the next edition of Margins and Mortar.
Thanks, everybody.